Hello, everyone. Thanks for your patience. We're wrestling with a little bit of a technical issue of getting in one of our panelists connected, and we'll start here shortly. Thanks for your patience. And there you are.
Oh, and all the controls are showing now. I don't know what happened.
Hey, it's the world of networking through a computer, so don't feel bad at all.
All right.
So thanks everyone for your patience as we get this started. My name is Rob Schorr. I'm a zoologist at the Colorado Natural Heritage Program, and I'll be your moderator today. As with many of you, I'm sharing office with a host of extra attendees, and so if you hear any snoring, it's a 11-year-old English bulldog in the background and not me. For those of you who aren't familiar with natural heritage programs, they were born out of the Nature Conservancy back in the 1970s as a tool for the Nature Conservancy to try and identify their last greatest places. So that team was there to try to identify where the rarest species are, where the assemblages of those species were, so that that could be how they targeted where they wanted to survey. That was back in the 1970s. And there are natural heritage programs in all the 50 states, all the provinces, and a host of Latin American and Caribbean countries. The relationship between each of those branches and their parent organization varies. So at the Colorado program, we're affiliated with Colorado State University, and we've been here at Colorado State University since 1994. And our whole purpose is to help our partners, whether it be federal, state, local, you name it, understand where those species exist, how they're doing, and help our collaborators plan for the conservation and management of those species. So you didn't tune in to hear me rattle on about all of the details and the history. So I'm going to get us started because we're a little bit behind. But before I do that, I wanted to take you through CSU's land acknowledgement statement. So Colorado State University acknowledges with respect that the land CSU is on is the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations and peoples. The area of CSU was also a site of trade, gathering, and healing for numerous other Native tribes. We recognize the indigenous peoples as original stewards of this land and are all the relatives within it. As these words of acknowledgement are spoken and heard, the ties nations have to their traditional homelands are renewed and reaffirmed. CSU is founded as a land grant institution, and we accept that our mission must encompass access to education and inclusion. And significantly, that our founding came at a dire cost to Native nations and peoples whose land this university was built upon. This acknowledgement is the education and inclusion we must practice in recognizing our institutional history, responsibility, and commitment. And I'm going to extend that CSU land acknowledgement statement to address specifically the area where John, Sovell, and Pam Smith worked, and they're going to tell you about. So we have to include that statement to extend to the Jicarilla Apache as well. So let me give you a little background on the presenters who are going to join us here shortly, and they'll share the presentation back and forth as we go through this. So Pam Smith has been with CNHP for 10 years as a botanist and ecologist. She conducts rare plant surveys, wildlife ecology surveys, and plant monitoring. She's an instructor for the CSU Extension Native Plant Master Certification courses and a forensic botanist for NecroSearch. That's an interesting investigation and go to NecroSearch. And Pam has over 20 years been working using her botanical expertise in Colorado, Ohio, Michigan, Arkansas, and North Carolina. John Sovell is a wildlife ecologist and has worked with CNHP since 1998. His 30-year career includes managing and coordinating research projects on Colorado's rare wildlife and has conducted research on trumpeter swan in Alaska's Copper River Delta, the population cycles of snowshoe hare in Canada's Yukon Territory, and he's been monitoring populations of the threatened Pawnee mountain skipper for upwards near a decade here at the Colorado South Platte River drainage. So with less talking from me and more talking from our presenters, I'm going to free it up to let them go. I think, Pam, you go ahead and share your screen as you need.
Okay.
Oh, and audience, feel free to ask questions to the Q&A. I'll try and monitor that and pass those along to our presenters. And I'll be here in attendance the whole time.
Okay. So do I have to share the screen or are you sharing it?
You should be able to.
Okay, I see that. I see that. I'm gonna bring it to the front. Okay, share screen. That's the one. Share. Okay. Old ladies. All right, let's get this going. Okay.
And we see your slide biodiversity survey.
And you did see that? You see that? Okay. So John and I have been working together on biological surveys for a number of years, and this picture was taken 10 years ago. I didn't know you'd get to see us on the Zoom meeting or not. So I picked a picture that was 10 years old, and we've done lots of surveys together. Our work complements each other, but I'd like to mention too that the survey at Fisher's Peak State Park was done by a number of other biologists. We're just sharing all the results with you. This was an interesting day. We had worked all day when we had come across the sign, so I'm pretty happy to be alive today. How about you, John?
Yeah, thanks, Pav, and thanks, Rob, for the introduction. Yeah, that's actually the Showalter mine up by Ralston Reservoir, and it was at that time an EPA site, Superfund site, which I think is shut down, and they've completed the work there. And so, yeah, thanks for the introduction, Rob. I've been with the Heritage Program since the early 2000 and have worked on a number of different wildlife species, at-risk species in Colorado. And with that, I guess we'll move on.
Yeah, all right.
And so on this slide, Rob gave a great introduction to the Heritage Program, and I don't want to spend much time on it. I just want to draw your attention to the third bullet point there that's highlighted in yellow. So the purpose of our work at Fisher's Peak State Park was to provide data for park management personnel in order to develop recreation activities on the park.
Okay, and for those of you who may not know, Fisher's Peak State Park is about as far south as you can go in Colorado. It's on the New Mexico border line, right along another state park in New Mexico called Sugar Canyon. The gold star is Fort Collins, so just get on I-25 and head south.
And anyone who's familiar with Las Animas County and the city of Trinidad pretty much knows where Fisher's Peak State Park is. So it's right on the county line. Southern border is, or county line, the state line between New Mexico and Colorado. And the western boundary of the new park is essentially I-25. And the eastern boundary is essentially the edge of the escarpment for the Fisher's Peak Mesa and Raton Mesa.
Okay, when John and I started this survey, we started back in 2019 when it was called Crazy French Ranch. And it was kind of crazy there, but the name comes from a Frenchman who purchased the property many years ago. And people in the outlying area thought he was a bit crazy because there's very few water resources there, and it doesn't seem like it would be a good place to make a living ranching. In 2019, 19,200 acres, the 19,200 acre Crazy French Ranch was purchased. It had been in private holdings for over 100 years, and this is going to be significant for some of the things that we were able to find there. In October, this past October, it became Colorado's second largest state park. And as these things go, it takes a lot of work with multiple different groups. And this was a collaboration between many people. But just to list a few, the City of Trinidad, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, the Nature Conservancy, Great Outdoors Colorado, and the Trust for Public Land were all involved in years of work to get this to be our new state park. And of course, one of the most notable features of the park is Fisher's Peak, 9,633 feet in elevation, making it the highest point in the United States east of its longitude. So it's pretty spectacular, and it's been in private holdings for over 100 years. So I think the public is pretty excited to get out there and explore.
So as we alluded to earlier in the discussion, this project was undertaken to essentially understand where sensitive habitats and at-risk species occur on the property that is now the state park. And this was a very focused survey. So we are spending a great deal of time in the office before we even access the property, and we're generating lists given the habitat types that occur on the property of particularly at-risk species and habitats that may occur at the site. And then we're looking at Landsat imagery, other types of imagery, and trying to find the best examples of habitat on the property to go to and look for the biological resources that we have identified as targets. And the purpose of all of this is to generate information that can feed into the conservation action plan for the park, and also the master development plan for the park.
Okay, so let's talk about what we found. For the botany survey, we found a lot of plants. We have a plant list of 454 species. These represent 14% of the total list of species known from Colorado. So that was kind of exciting when you realize that Fisher's Peak State Park is only about 0.4% of the land area. We found 13 tracked rare plant species, including multiple occurrences of some of them, 3 rare plant communities, and 7 species known only to the vicinity of the area. The only place in the world they're known is from the Colorado-New Mexico border, 7 endemic species. In Colorado, we have 108 total endemic species, and 7 of them are here at Fisher's Peak State Park. And the wildlife was pretty good too, wasn't it, John?
Yeah, it was. We found 186 different species of animals on the park. And as I said before, it's a fairly focused effort that we undertook. So there's definitely more species out there that we did not identify. There were a number of biologists on the ground. This is probably, as far as actual boots and researchers on the ground, the largest collaborative effort that I've been involved in my 20 years at CNHP. And so it's an amazing diversity of animals on the site. Of all of those animals, we recorded 12 at-risk species that are tracked by CNHP. And the rarest of those species was the New Mexico meadow jumping mouse, Sapis hudsonius luteus. And this is kind of the end product. So this is the spatial representation of all of those at-risk habitats and species that were identified on the park. Vegetation on the left, wildlife on the right. And one of the things I'd like to point out is farther down along the legend on the right-hand map, you can see, hopefully, elk. And it shows some severe winter range. We did not survey during the winter, and understanding the location and distribution of elk on the landscape is way beyond a targeted inventory that is taking basically a snapshot at a specific point in time. This is information that is from species activity maps that are developed by Colorado Parks and Wildlife. So it's kind of an indication of the extent of the collaboration that's going on here to help understand how to best both supply recreation to the public as well as conserve the natural resources that occur in the park.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the botany resources. Who doesn't love botany? Not only were there a lot of biologists, professional biologists helping us, but we had our group of CNHP Sigley internship program students, and they were amazing. Not only can they carry shovels, but they're very good at helping find plants in the wild, and it was a wonder to have them. And the photos that you're going to see throughout this presentation were provided, well, some of them by Emma Balonek, another past Sigley intern. So it's pretty rugged out there at Fisher's Peak State Park, and the landscape is incredibly diverse. And tucked within this rugged landscape are old growth woodlands. Even though this area was heavily developed over 100 years ago, it's been relatively untouched since then. And much of the old forests have regrown. There's shrublands, woodlands, grasslands, meadows, types of meadows we call balds. There's different types of wetlands, over 60 springs, I think. There's streams, ponds, and some of the steepest canyons you'll ever see, and some pretty stiff cliffs. So John was talking about, how do we survey 19,200 acres? We certainly do a triage for botany. We got out our maps and looked for where rare plants maybe have been seen in the past, but since it's been private property, it's not really been surveyed. So we had to kind of guess where they might be, and also talk to resource management and say, where do you think you're going to want to develop it? Where are people going to want to be? And those were also areas of focus for us. The photo on the right shows some of our professional botanists who helped out. Jennifer Ackerfield in the middle wrote The Flora of Colorado. She works at Denver Botanic Gardens now. And next to her, Dina Clark, who did a lion's share of the botanical work out there. And Steve Olson representing the U.S. Forest Service. Dina is from CU Boulder, and her helper, Nan Letter, also helped out. So we had a lot of good botany going on. So our huge plant list, it was very interesting to find that 64% of the list were actually flowering plants. And in 2019, we'd had some nice rainfall that year and an amazing diversity of species. And I'd love to talk about each and every one of them, but we don't have time, darn it. 2020 was much drier. One of the plants I would like to focus on a little bit is pinyon pine. Although it's not that common in northern Colorado, down around the Trinidad area, it's much more common, and it's definitely more common in our surrounding states than it is in Colorado, as you can see by the distribution map on the left. But what we found at Fishers State Park is in the old growth areas of pinyon pine, we found some of our rarest plants. There's a pretty plant I'm going to let you look at a minute before I tell you its name, because I absolutely hate the name of this plant. But it's a beautiful blue aster that looks like its leaves could be related to the holly plant or something, or they're a tiny bit prickly, which may be why the Latin name is, the species epithet is horrida. It's had 3 names. If you look it up on USDA plants, it's called Eurybia horrida, but we track it as Herrickia horrida. Herrick is the name of a human. It was named after another biologist. So the other name for it isn't much better unless you understand New Mexican geography, the Canadian River spiny aster, and it's endemic to Colorado and New Mexico. We track it as a G3, which means it's globally vulnerable and very rare in our state, S1. The only thing I can find horrid about this plant is where we actually have to go survey for it. I don't know if you can see these cliffs on the left underneath this mature pinyon pine, but it's some pretty rock and territory that we had to survey to find this plant. But it is known from the Canadian River Basin in New Mexico, thus the name Canadian River spiny aster. And this is the whole known distribution for it in the world. So it just barely gets up into Colorado here in Los Animas County. The absolute rarest plant we found there, Dina Clark found it, was the Capulan goldenrod, Solidago capulinensis. We didn't actually know it was in Colorado till 2011. It had been discovered at the Capulan Volcano National Monument site years ago, and that's where we thought it was. But Dina Clark and some other colleagues discovered populations across the southern part of Colorado, but not very many of them. And this also grows in the older growth pinyon pine, also mixed with old growth 1-seed juniper in this weird limestone type formation. You'll have to pardon my blurry picture, but there's not too many pictures available of it because it's so rare. G2 is globally imperiled. S1 means state critically imperiled for Colorado. So our only known populations are along the southern part of Los Animas County and into Baca County. So here's a view of our area that we're looking at from the air. Capulan Volcano National Monument's way down in the south, and Fisher's Peak is way up here in the north. But you can see the habitat with all the mesas are all there. Mesa de Maya is up here on the right, and Fisher's Peak Mesa is just below Fisher's Peak, just to give you an idea of the lay of the land. The other exciting thing about Fisher's Peak State Park is it opened up a whole bunch of public land adjacent to existing public land. So with the 29,000 acres added by Fisher's Peak Mesa alongside the state wildlife areas that are near its eastern border and the area to the south at Sugarite Canyon State Park, there's over 55 miles of land that will now be accessible to the public. That's a lot of land. One of the plants we talked about a lot during our surveys was a New Mexican locust. It's not rare. It's actually more common in the southern part of the state, but it's definitely a southwestern species. It attracts a lot of butterflies, including rare butterflies, but you typically see it in a shrub form, not in this woodland type association. And at Fisher's Peak State Park, there were literally plant communities of this woodland, and this might even be considered an older growth woodland. The trees that Dave Anderson here is walking under have been cored, some of them in areas of Fisher's Peak State Park by biologists, and they were coming up at over 100 years old. And the understory is very interesting because there's no shrubs really. It's definitely herbaceous. And many times the herb layer was stinging nettle, which was really fun, wasn't it, John? You like that? But there were other old growth areas too that had old growth Douglas fir and white fir. And the fascinating thing about these areas that have trees and that are over 100 years old is that they're different from newer early succession stage forests. There's more fallen trees, the overstore is higher, so different plants and animals grow there, like vastly different. The root mass is different. There's a greater variety of nutrients. The soil drain's different. The aeration's different. When you see a tree, the root system below it is at least 50% or more of what you see above the ground. And this provides more types of habitat. So the more biodiversity of habitats you have, the greater the biodiversity of organisms you have, and the more resilient your landscape becomes. And it turns out that many of our rare species were found in the older growth areas of the park. One of my favorite areas I stumbled upon heading to somewhere else with John, we were headed up to a wetland, was this porcupine grass grassland. Not only is porcupine grass fairly uncommon, some people consider it actually rare in Colorado, but seeing it as a dominant in a grassland is even less common. This is something that would have been much more common in the Central Plains. So this is kind of a tall grass prairie remnant just hanging out here at Fisher's Peak State Park. It's closely related to our needle and thread grass that's much more common. One of the reasons we may not see it so much anymore is because it's intolerant of grazing. This is just a close-up of the needle part of the needle and thread grass. It's really sharp. These are fascinating grasses. They have self-planting seeds. When it's dry, they curl up into this odd shape, and when it's wet, they're straight. The porcupine grass needles are shown on the left, so you can see how much bigger they are than just a regular needle and thread grass. I couldn't find any pictures of the straight needle and thread grass except for the one the students were throwing at me when we were doing the survey. It's in my backpack. So that's an interesting plant community. So one of the focal points is definitely the cliffs, and that's where everybody's going to go. And you look up at these cliffs and think, wow, there can't be too many plants and animals up there. But it turns out nothing could be further from the truth. This is the hotbed of activity and where some of the coolest plants and animals are found in the park. This is a botany survey along the cliffs. It's actually quite dangerous up there. So this is going to be a resource management challenge for sure. Mike Figgs and Dina Clark are doing a survey right there. You can see a burn scar that's filling in with New Mexican locust down at the bottom. So that's a nice recovery from a fire that happened over 10 years ago. You could already tell the view from the cliffs is quite amazing. It's another view. But what's exciting, we get really excited when we got there. There's a lot more plants and animals up there than you might imagine. You can see the lichens, there's rare ferns, there's shrubs growing in the cracks and crevices of these trees. And I want you to notice too that there's trees growing here. And this is important because a number of the species we found in these cracks and crevices are actually more common in the subalpine or even in the alpine above tree line. In the foreground here, this isn't Crazy French Ranch. This is just an example of the alpine. You can see King's Crown, which we commonly find in wet meadows. But in the alpine, sometimes it's found in rock crevices, alpine rock crevices. And this is how it looks at Fisher's Peak State Park. It grows in rock crevices there. This was fairly unexpected because we're definitely not above normal tree line. Other alpine species included Baker's alpine parsley, Cymopterus bakeri, typically doesn't grow below 12,000 feet. What is it doing here? I don't know. This place is really interesting. Another one of our very rare species is Draba smithii, Smith's Draba, not named after me, darn it. It's very rare in New Mexico and quite rare in Colorado. We call it G2S2, and that's considered globally imperiled. Distribution in Colorado is something like this. Even though it's in a number of counties, there's not very much of it. And it's known from just one county, Taos County in New Mexico. The other fabulous place that people are going to want to try to visit are the mesa tops. This is where a lot of the state wildlife lands lie, are on the mesa tops. And some of Fisher's Peak State Park is along the mesa tops as well. But it's so interesting. You climb what is essentially the top of a 96,000 foot mountain, and you feel like you're out on the Eastern Plains on the top. It's just a fascinating, crazy world up there. And not only are the grasslands beautiful, they're very biodiverse. They're not weedy. At least in many of the places where I've seen photos of. I didn't make it to the mesa top. These pictures are by Emma Balanek, but in just one picture, you can see the biodiversity that's there. A couple of rare species. The marsh meadow Indian paintbrush is in the foreground there, G4S2. So globally, apparently secure, state imperiled plant. But in just one picture, there's probably 30 or 40 different species, including a very rare sedge. Sedges are typically wetland species, but once in a while we find some in the uplands, and this grassy slope sedge happens to be one that we track. It's globally vulnerable. It's one of our endemic species, and it's imperiled in Colorado. Carex aureacris. Nice photo, Emma. Emma also took this beautiful picture of Perry's oak grass grassland, which is what dominates most of the mesa tops and just below. We track it as globally vulnerable, and it's quite rare in Colorado. But what's exceptional about the grasslands at Fisher's Peak State Park is that they're large and they're intact. There's other Perry's oak grasslands in Colorado, but they're more disturbed. Some of them have a lot of pasture grasses and weeds mixed in, but it's pretty nice up here at Fisher's Peak State Park. This is another great photo that shows you the biodiversity of habitats, the cliffs, the mesa tops. There's actually water, a pond in the middle too that has rare plants and some animals that John's going to talk about too. But you can see how the grasslands kind of creep down into Fisher's Peak State Park. There's shrublands, woodlands. This matrix of environments is what makes for high biodiversity and what makes for a very resilient landscape, as long as we do not develop it incorrectly and don't over fragment this landscape. So this is my reminder here that it's time to turn the show over to John to tell you a little bit about his finds of plants and animals.
Thanks, Pam.
You're welcome.
So I'm going to talk about the animal species, and this is a short list. They're just as vegetation community was incredibly diverse, so is the animal community, but because of limitations of time, I'm only going to speak on a few of the things that we found. And one of those things that I'm not going to talk about is the shorthorn lizard, which was one of our target species on our list. So the first, you can go on to the next slide, Pam. So the first species that I want to talk about is the New Mexico jumping mouse. And again, a photo by Emma Balanek there. So on these slides, to give you some orientation. So when we find these representations of these animals on the landscape, we're kind of looking at that population as it occurs, where it is, and trying to understand what condition it's in there and what may be the main issues surrounding the conservation for the animals. So that's kind of what I put here on the slides, is the important characteristics for that population at that location. And then in the italics, in the smaller font, I've kind of pulled out some things that we have recommended in the report that we rewrote on the data that we collected. So some of the recommendations that are about 2 pages long in the report that pertain to the particular species. And in this case, the New Mexico meadow jumping mouse is a riparian species, and it really requires lush vegetation, riparian vegetation. It needs shrub overstories, and it needs very thick and lush forb understory. So maintaining the integrity of that habitat is important for this mouse. And that obviously means protecting the water resources, which that habitat is dependent on. Also, one of the things that is important for this mouse is also maintaining connectivity between local populations and maintaining the genetic fitness within those local populations and supporting population resilience. Next slide. So as Pam mentioned about the vegetation, the 2019 was a great year for the plant diversity on the property. And that was also true of the lepidopteran community. It was an amazing year for leps. And also, since I'm thinking about vegetation, I was gonna talk about, as I started my part, Pam had mentioned that New Mexico locust. Those forests of locusts, and that plant, I think, has the largest spines on it of any plant I've come across in Colorado. So working within that vegetation type, if you did not have a long sleeve shirt on, you would probably come out pretty scratched up, plus the fact that you're trying to deal with those stinging nettles in the understory as well. But moving on to butterfly community, the diversity of the community was quite incredible. We identified 8 different families represented on the property. Of the actual individual species we found, 5 of them are endemic to that area of Colorado, and 3 of those species are at-risk species, which were on our target list, including the Watona abomuk skipper, which the photo is showing there on the wall. So some of the important considerations for the diversity of butterflies on the property is grazing. So incompatible grazing that results in the decline of the host plant, or also very important are the nectarine resources. So also the forb community. So anything that happens to disturb the landscape and reduces that native vegetation cover is going to be an issue for the lepidopteran community. Also, fire suppression can be an issue. So this abomuk skipper is a species, a forest species that's actually looking for openings where sunlight is penetrating and you have a lush understory of both grasses and forbs. So anything fire suppression leading to filling in of those openings or overstory growth is going to be an issue for the lepidopteran community for some of the at-risk species. Next slide. Also, there is a nesting pair of peregrine falcon on actual Fisher's Peak, and that happens to be the area that was identified through a climbing survey that was conducted by a CNHP biologist. Happens to have the most stable rock in the entire park and is probably the best place to develop recreational climbing. So that is going to be an issue, trying to supply that opportunity to the public, as well as protecting not only that nesting pair of falcons, but also these cliff faces are very important areas where bats can find roosting habitat. Next slide. So there is the actual great picture of the escarpment. It's the habitat which is occupied by the peregrine falcons. And this type of cliff is represented all along the escarpment, pretty much from the northern boundary of the park to the state line, southern boundary of the park along the New Mexico-Colorado border. Also, I wanted to give a shout out before I go on to Christian, the photographer of this picture. Christian is a researcher, a biologist with one of the governmental agencies in Boulder County, and he spent a great deal of time on the park over the 2 summers, and a lot of the data that fed into the report and the information we're presenting here is data that was collected by Christian, so thanks to him. So as I mentioned, those cliff faces are important resources for the bat community. CNHP, through actual MistNet surveys and acoustic sampling, was able to verify 8 individual species bats at the park, and 5 of those species, over 50%, are species at risk, including the silver-haired bat in the photo to the left there. So obviously, as I mentioned, recreational climbing has potential to have an impact to the bat community, and is going to have to be managed to help mitigate any potential impacts. Also, a loss of habitat from logging and deforestation is an issue for bat communities. Not only are those areas important foraging habitat, but they also can supply roosting trees for certain individual species of bats. Also, probably less of a concern, given that, as we haven't mentioned yet, but most of the landscape to the east of the park, across the escarpment, where those grasslands that Pam showed, are actually state wildlife areas. It's a huge area, protected area that extends across Fisher's Peak Mesa, as well as Raton Mesa, and also into New Mexico, into a large area that's protected by a state park in New Mexico. So the actual development of wind on that escarpment is probably not an issue. I'm not sure what CPW's, what they allow as far as activities on the state wildlife areas. But if they were to develop any wind there, it probably would be at the edge of that escarpment between the boundary of the state wildlife areas and the park. And it could be an issue, and it should be something that is considered during development of management activities at the state park. Next slide. As a researcher, I've spent a great deal of time studying mollusks throughout Colorado. And right now, Pam and I are actually involved in some research in Jefferson County, basically conducting an assessment similar to this for the county. And this is a follow-up to some work we did around 2010, 2011. And I don't think throughout the entire extent of that county, I found as diverse of a community as mollusks as I did on this property. It's quite an amazing place. And also to consider that because of the activity on the landscape, was a working ranch. And also because of the fact that it is an incredibly dry place, there are really not that much of an aquatic resource available on the property. And most all of that resource has been developed for ranching. Yet there is this very diverse community of mollusks. Part of the reason may be that there's actually a benefit to some of the ponding, like the pond here shown in this picture, actually supplies habitat for some of the species that I found, which require more stagnant waters, whereas others require more free flowing waters, such as available in other areas of the park, like along Clear Creek, the Clear Creek drainage. Next slide. So as anyone could imagine, the most important aspect for maintaining diversity of the mollusk community is going to be protecting the integrity of the water resource. Mollusks are very sensitive to any disturbance to water quality. So anything that occurs on the landscape, roads, trails, construction of infrastructure, that increases sedimentation within the water resources is going to be an issue. Also, any forestry practices that may be undertaken on the property that increases siltation, or anything that may result in pollution or agricultural runoff, or even if there is in the future allowed grazing within the park, there's going to have to be some consideration of the impacts of that grazing if it's allowed to occur along riparian areas of the park. Next slide.
All right, so
I'm going to turn it back over to Pam for this.
Thanks, John. This is just a lovely photo. I think this was taken by Chris Pegg. Oh, there it is up at the top of the landscape. I think one of the wonderful things I think that the CPW has in mind is actually phasing in trails and things like that, because the biological studies aren't finished here. So if you go visit Trinidad State Park, it's only a little part of it is actually opened, and there's some shorter trails in the north end. But over time and over a few years, they're going to start developing trails, but they are waiting till they get all the biological surveys in. But the less we can fragment some of this landscape and target some of the developments that will need to occur to areas perhaps that have already been developed or disturbed would benefit this area greatly.
And Pam, you meant Fisher's Peak, right?
What did I say?
I think you said Trinidad, if I just want to make sure.
Oh, I always do that. Fisher's Peak State Park. There is Trinidad Lake State Park, which is different. Yeah, thank you, Rob. So what's invisible to most of us, though, are that these intact landscapes give us, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of benefits that we don't recognize in monetary terms. This matrix of landscapes is more resistant to things like drought, many of the impacts from climate change, like large temperature and precipitation fluctuations, insect invasions that we've seen in other parts of the mountains because some of these areas have been left alone for a number of years. They keep wildfires from burning too hot. So some of wildfire mitigation that happens in other forests may not need to happen here. And the non-native species, only 10% of our list was non-native, which is very low. Most places that I survey are 16% and higher that are natural areas. And when you get closer to urban areas, it's more like 50 to 60% non-native. And noxious weeds were less than 2% here. And I think that's because a lot of the major disturbances happened so long ago. We didn't have a lot of the seed banks for the really noxious species that we have now in Colorado. Also, these big, beautiful landscapes provide a lot of water filtration and air filtration. They're excellent native seed sources. There are some habitats here that just aren't common everywhere in the state. Rare plants, some people say, what good is a rare plant? To me, they're excellent indicators of really good habitat quality most of the time. So thank you all for joining us, and I think we have time for questions. I put our John and my contact information at the bottom.
We do have time for questions if they come up. We've purposely kind of kept the windows restricted to us, so I'll try and monitor those as they come in through the Q&A or through the comment section. Appreciate you guys taking us through that. In the meantime, as we wait for a couple of those, so Pam, you mentioned the age of the pinyon pine forest here. Where else in Colorado do you see that kind of age structure for pinyon pine?
Well, I wish I could answer that question. It's a lot of the pinyon pine populations are on the west slope, and I work mostly on the east slope. So for me, on the east slope, this is very unique to see. I've not seen pinyon pines get all gnarly and curled up like that. Most of them are more shrubby looking.
So Pam, I'll just kind of interject here. One of the projects I worked on in 2019 was a survey for development of some mountain bike trails on Colorado Mountain College campus. Trying to think of the name of it. I can't think of it, but basically just outside of Glenwood Springs, between Carbondale and Glenwood. And there is an amazing pinyon pine old growth forest that exists on that landscape. And also extends onto some of the private ranches that surround the campus of the college. And this was very reminiscent. What we saw at Fisher's Peak was very reminiscent of some of those old growth that occurs on the west slope.
Can you guys see the questions that might be coming in through the comments? If not, I can read them to you. Okay. So Chris had asked, given the timeline for this kind of survey, Chris Peg had asked, given the timeline for the survey, do you think there's additional need for survey? You guys were able to visit for 2 years. Is there, what's your feedback or ideas on how much more or how sufficiently you think it has been surveyed?
Yeah, I guess I do, definitely from an animal standpoint, and I'll let Pam pipe in as what her thoughts are on the plants. But I think one of the opportunities that's available here is to actually do some monitoring. Once they begin to develop out the park, to be able to understand what the impacts may be happening, is actually monitor some of these things like the butterfly community. And whether or not they're in, also the vegetation that's supporting them. As there be changes, has recreation introduced invasive species? Has that crowded out some of the native species that are required for some of these animals? If grazing is allowed on some areas, what impact does that have on the vegetation resource? And how is that then indirectly associated with impacts to the animal populations, particularly something like the jumping mouse along the riparian areas?
Yeah, I think I'm speaking for myself and some other researchers who worked out there with me too, including Dina Clark. I think there is a lot of need for more surveys out there. Some of the photos I saw that Christian Nunez took, he didn't know what some of the plants were, but it ended up, some of them were quite rare. And I think some of those spots need to be visited as well. It's 19,200 acres, and we only really got to see it for a few weeks during some of the main summer months. I think early spring and some of the other seasons haven't been well surveyed as well. And plant communities are a little harder. And part of the surveys that were already done include vegetation mapping. And I think that will help lead us to some other interesting areas as well. I think it'd be very important to take another look at this area. It's quite big, and I know we didn't see everything that's there by a long shot.
And there's probably rare species that we have not identified that probably still occur there.
Yeah, and since the park is phasing in the trails, I think that's a good way to slowly start looking across the park where they're going to target next. Maybe we could start looking at more closely.
And that's probably a caveat we need to add to most any of the short timeline inventories that we get to do, is that we get a great opportunity to document what we can find. But even in a 1 to 2 year summer specific survey period, is that we can be challenged to find everything that could exist there.
Right, and the trails aren't developed there. So even just getting up to the cliffs is, it's like several hours just to get there. And then you have to survey it. And if the weather comes in, you gotta,
Through
and
stinging nettle and through locust. So I got a question for you, Pam. I think how large, it's pretty specific to one particular community, how large was the acreage of the Perry's oakgrass community? And before you answer that, try and relay the importance of that specific community.
I don't know. I would have to get a map out and tell you how large it is, but I know from the grasslands that I've walked, it's huge. It's magnificent. It's bigger than anything I've ever seen. Some of them cover like the sizes of typical open spaces or something, and that would be a really huge one, like 30 acres or something, but they're usually not in good shape. They are modeled old communities that used to be a solid stand of an oak grass community. I can't even comprehend how much is up there. And I don't know what shape all of it is in. They put a big pipeline in on top of Fisher's Peak Mesa. I don't know what it looks like up there, but it looks from the photos I've seen, it looks amazing.
And are those communities at the top of the mesas?
Mm-hmm. That's all Perry. Well, I think it's all Perry's oakgrass. Yeah.
Given that that's kind of a unique area, that elevation, and to have flat tops with those kind of communities, do you think there's a network of islands around there that might have similar animal and plant communities that maybe haven't been investigated yet?
Sure, definitely. I think some areas
probably farther to the east, is it Mesa de Maya?
Yeah,
I think is similar, as well as some of those other areas of higher elevation surrounding the area around Mesa de Maya are very similar. One of the projects I worked on in the mid 2000s was a survey of the private ranch land surrounding Pinyon Canyon Maneuver Site, and some of that habitat is similar to what's here. And I'm not sure, we probably did find some of those species that are represented here on Mesa de Maya and some of those other private ranches. But not being a botanist, I can't say for sure.
Well, then I'll shoot one right at you, John. The diversity of butterflies in that area was pretty astounding. Is there anything any species specific associations that you know of that might be unique to that area? Are there pollination requirements, maybe that's from some of the plants that Pam was able to find and her crew, that may identify why they're so localized?
Yeah, I think, yes, definitely. I think there's also a team of researchers from CSU out there actually doing vegetation mapping. And I think it comes back to what Pam was talking about, and I think demonstrated in her part of the talk about the diversity of habitat types, just the number of biomes that occur on the former ranch, the park, supports the diversity of butterflies. There are different butterflies in every single last one of those biomes that are going to be found in the pinyon pine and, not in the grassland, or are going to be found in more dense forest, but not in the more open forest where you might have openings and pockets of grasses and forbs. There's going to be species found in those shrublands and those Gambel's oak that are going to be different than species that are found in the forest or in the grassland. And there's going to be species that are associated, with some of those unique characteristics that are created by the escarpment in the cliffs and the rocky, screens that occurs there that you don't see anywhere else except for in the mountains.
And it may take more than 1 or 2 times visiting to identify what those resource needs are.
Yeah.
I have a friend who identified a rare butterfly that he's only seen in the east, Dave Leatherman, on the New Mexican locust tree. So there's a lot to figure out about this area. Really, it hasn't been surveyed. A lot of the southeastern part of Colorado.
You know, and it might even be worthwhile to think about extending those survey efforts up onto the escarpment and onto some of those state wildlife areas. Try and understand what the vegetation community and animal community, I'm sure CPW has done some extensive survey work already on those areas, but I think the Heritage Program can offer a collaborative effort that maybe covers some things that they may not, survey for.
Yeah, I remember you mentioning the specific biology of those cliff systems, and I think you mentioned that we had a biologist, Andrew Schumann, who was actually climbing, rappelling there, looking for bats in some habitats up there. So yeah, I think there are some answers that still have yet to be addressed, or questions have yet to be addressed, but maybe taking a different solution to inventory those may be the solution. All right, well, I'm going to thank Pam and John again for taking time to take us through this unique area of Colorado. It makes me a little anxious now that the sun is shining a little bit more to get out and start doing some field biology again. So again, thank you guys for joining us today. And our next talk is going to be March 8th, and it's going to be Landscape Scale Resource Monitoring, CNHP's partnership, and the Bureau of Land Management's Assessment, Inventory, and Monitoring Program. And so we hope you can join us then, and we look forward to telling you more about what CNHP does. Thanks, everybody.